Welcome, everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. My name is Tamil Kendall, and I'm the director of the Partnership for Women's Health Research Canada, also known as POWER. POWER is a national alliance between the Women's Health Research Institute in BC, the Women and Children's Health Research Institute in Alberta, the Women and Children's Health Research Institute in Alberta, Women's College Hospital, Research and Innovation Institute in Ontario, and IWK Health in the Maritimes. Previous slide, please. Our shared vision is better health for all women, trans, and non-binary people through research equity, excellence, and inclusion. This event today and the release of the National Beyond the Binary Resource Guide is extremely important for us. Next slide. And I want to acknowledge our partners and the funders who made this work possible. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, specifically the Institute of Gender and Health, and Michael Smith Health Research BC. Next slide. Before we get into the content, housekeeping. Now, we believe we have had a bit of challenge with it this morning, but that we have interpretation. So let's just try this to make sure that this is working.
No, it's not working.
So for the audience, you go into interpretation and choose the channel that you want to listen on. If there continues to be a challenge with this, please message the host in the Q&A function. Next slide, please. So what we are going to do this afternoon is to share content in different ways as we move through the agenda. Next slide, please. And we ask that everyone really align with these guiding values that we shared in advance for this event and are summarized on this slide. Next slide, please. And by scanning this QR code, you can access the agenda as well as the resource guide. Now I'd like to turn to introducing Elder Sandy Leo Laframboise. Next slide, please. Pronoun she, her, and ask her to start us off in a good way. Elder Sandy is a knowledge keeper with the Two-Spirit community, a registered celebrant, elder for the Can-Hep-C Indigenous Roadmap, and elder in residence at the Junction Recovery Program at Vancouver Coastal Health. Thank you so much for being here, Elder Sandy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bonjour, Anine. HKCM. I call and come in from the ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam. I am Métis. My father's Algonquin, my mother's Cree, French, and Irish. I have been granted and been invited to access land on the Tsleil-Waututh traditional territory where I lead ceremonies. And as such, it is always important to me to recognize our sovereign land, our unceded territories, and our relationship with the land and the local First Nations. It is an honor to be here and to welcome everybody here on this beautiful webinar. It has been a journey of unlocking a door and weaving a basket of stories as we come together. It's always invigorating, exciting, and challenging when science policies come together and look at health and realize there's a little disalignment between both, from the natural world, where we have over 500 species that are non-binary, to our creation stories as Indigenous people, where there are transformation stories and stories of creation where genders go beyond what's in front of us. And to have that aligned together and to unlock that door and to open our mind as we journey through this forest of differences. You know, when you walk into a forest, there's this beautiful, big, tall cedar tree and this little berry bush and this little other ugly kind of judgmental bush, but they don't say to each other they don't belong together. A forest takes everybody. A village takes everybody. And to be on this journey together, it's exciting to see what tomorrow is going to be as we ground ourselves in the present. This journey has begun with the BC under the auspice of Bev and others, where we created the BC Beyond the Binary, and then it came into a national journey, and it's a wonderful canoe journey as we embark in this together. I look forward to hearing back, and I thank you and I welcome you all in a good way, all my relations. Aichkasiam.
Thank you very much, Elder Sandy. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lori Brotto and Heather McCain. Dr. Brotto, pronouns she, her, is the executive director of the Women's Health Research Institute and a full professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of British Columbia. She is a national leader in research on sexual dysfunction among gender diverse populations of all sexual orientations, and she is a fierce advocate for gender equitable women's health research. Heather McCain, pronouns they, them, is founder and executive director of Live Education Transform Society, LETS, formerly Creating Accessibility Neighborhoods, a nonprofit they started in 2005. Heather built LETS from a small grassroots organization in 2 communities to an organization delivering workshops and adding their voice to projects and events across Turtle Island. Welcome, Heather and Lori, and I'll turn it over to you, Lori.
Thank you very much, Tamil. Thank you for that beautiful welcome, Elder Sandy, and very grateful to be in this space with you all. I'm going to get us started in a good way by bringing us to the present moment. We're all obviously very excited about today's Beyond the Binary launch. And to help us really get the most out of what we're all going to hear, we're going to come into the present. So I invite all of you, we're going to spend a few moments now just coming into the present moment. So the first thing we do with this brief practice together is I invite you to close your eyes if that feels acceptable to you. And just take a moment to get comfortable in whatever position you are in right now, whether you're seated in a chair, or maybe you're standing, and taking a moment to just make whatever adjustments you would like to make to get comfortable in the present moment. And so the first step that we'll do together is to become aware, really aware of what's going on with you right now. Becoming aware of what's popping up in your mind. What thoughts can you identify? And as best as you can, just noting the thoughts as mental events. So we can note them and we can note the feelings that are around them at the moment. And in particular, turning toward any sense of discomfort or unpleasant feelings, as well as the comfortable and pleasant feelings. And rather than trying to push them away, rather we say, ah, here you are. That's how it is right now. And so now that we've got a sense of what's going on, we've stepped out of autopilot. The second step is to collect our awareness by focusing on a single object, the movements of the breath. And so now we really gather ourselves, focusing attention on the movements of the abdomen, the rise and fall of the breath, and spending a moment or two just binding our awareness to the patterns of movement in the place where the breath is making itself known to you. Gathering yourself and using the anchor of the breath to be really present. And now, in this third and final step, having gathered ourselves to some extent, we allow our awareness to expand. As well as being aware of the breath, we also include a sense of the many individual sensations in the body as a whole, so that we invite this more spacious awareness. A sense of sensations in the body as a whole, including tightness or sensations related to holding in the shoulders or neck or back or face. And noticing all the various sensations as they arise moment by moment, holding them in this slightly softer, more spacious awareness. And when you're ready, bringing this awareness back with you as we regroup as a community, allowing your eyes to open. And with that, we'll continue on with our presentation for today. Next. Thank you. Okay. I have the pleasure of providing some background to the work that we have done collectively and beyond the binary. And at the heart of this discussion, it's important to understand what we mean by sex and gender. These may be familiar terms to all of you. Sex refers to the biological and physiological differences among sexes, including chromosomes and hormones, and is an assignment usually made by a clinician at the time of birth based on the appearance of the genitals. Gender is a psychosocial construct, which includes gender identity, how a given society, including the support within that society, may have different expectations based on a person's gender. Next, neither sex nor gender are binary. And in research, we've not done a great job at disaggregating by sex nor by gender. Thanks to some sex disaggregated research, we have evidence that females present with more adverse effects from new pharmacological drugs than males. But for the longest time, up to only about 20 years ago, females were not routinely included in clinical trials, and few publications disaggregated by sex. And in fact, a recent analysis of clinical trials showed that only a quarter of the clinical trial data are analyzed by sex. Like sex, gender is also not consistently included and measured and reported upon in research, and the consequence is immense. For example, feminine traits independent of sex increase one's risk for recurrent acute coronary syndrome, but gendered traits are usually not considered in research. Even when gender is included in analyses, it tends to take on a binary categorization of women and men and ignores the range of persons who identify as trans, gender diverse, non-binary, and other titles. The erasure of gender diverse persons further perpetuates the gap in appropriate gender disaggregated research. Next. So a tension exists, as you're probably surmising. While we've made tremendous advances in women's health research, the focus on women may result in the exclusion of trans women who are assigned female at birth, the exclusion of non-binary individuals who may be birth assigned females, but who do not align with the gendered label of woman, and other groups. Next. One popular alternative is the use of the gender-neutral language to reference individuals. Over the course of the COVID pandemic, we saw more discussions about an inclusive approach to understanding the impact of the virus and the vaccine on pregnant and lactating individuals, regardless of their gender, where the term women was commonly not used at all. There's also been a move away from women's cancers to referring to cancer's anatomy instead. Next. But as the call for more inclusive gender language grows, some have noted that there may be consequences to the adoption of this neutral language, including reducing people to being categorized by body parts that may render women and their histories invisible. For example, Black women and immigrant women experience worse health outcomes due to the intersection between their race and being a woman. To continue the important work of combating health inequities experienced by these and other groups, it is imperative that their experiences as racialized women be at the center. Next, consistent with some perinatal health organizations in the UK, some have recommended that we consider adopting a gender additive approach, and that clear, consistent, and precise language when describing research participants should be a starting point for gender inclusive research in women's health. This means that our research needs to include questions that probe sex and gender. When it is aligned with the main research question, every study should attempt to be inclusive of trans, non-cis women and others, as this is the only way to begin to build knowledge about the potentially unique or similar experiences of different gender groups. Next, change is challenging, but difficulty should not prohibit change, because a failure to do so will continue to marginalize not only gender diverse persons, but potentially women as well. There's a vital need for more health research on gender diverse persons, and there's an equally vital need for more health research on women. Next. Today, we wish to share with you the work that has been happening first in BC and then across Canada to address both the tension and the need for gender inclusive guidance for the research community through our project we proudly call Beyond the Binary. The guide we present today is culmination of multi-year collaborative, community engaged with people who experience or have experienced gender-based inequities, researchers, and research system partners. Collectively, we've learned throughout our journey that embodying and providing feedback using person-centered, justice-oriented, trauma-informed approaches is one that requires self-reflection, agility, and a commitment to the end goal. Next slide. The Beyond the Binary initiative began in 2019 when the PWHR identified a gap in resources for gender-inclusive language practice specific to a research setting. This led to funding from our provincial health Research BC through a convening and collaborating grant that allowed us to form partnerships with people who experience gender-based inequities and members of the women's health research community. This 18-month project resulted in a first version Beyond the Binary in BC guide. We are here today to release the work of a national scale-up and translation of the guide funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. This work involved the creation of a research task force and community task force and a roundtable to discuss and decide on content and structural changes to the guide. After developing the task force and identifying partners, the team reviewed the resource package, updated it to include national content, planned for dissemination activities, incorporated graphic design, as well as a French translation. With that, I'm very excited to pass over the microphone now to Heather McCain to tell you a little bit more about the work we undertook. Over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Lori. So the project started with 3 groups. We had, I think, the next slide. Oh, no, sorry. So the project started with 3 groups: members of the research community, members of community who represent people with lived or living experience of gender-based inequities, and a core team that connected both. Next. The model was community informed and to allow for safe dialogue that recognized health researchers are part of systems that have harmed and continue to harm community members. With this model, the core team were liaisons between the two groups to share and reconcile feedback over each project, while the groups initiated separately over time at the request of both. They had opportunities to connect as the work evolved. Preceding this new resource was the creation of a research task force and community task force, a roundtable to discuss and decide on content and structural changes to the guide, task force formation, partner identification, review of resource package, and the updated national content, dissemination planning, graphic design, and French translation. This slide has a word cloud that includes some of the identities of the beyond the binary members across the task forces and groups. And examples of identities are care providers, trans, researchers, community organizers, midwifery, trainees, non-binary, educators, two-spirit, and more. Next. The following is what we heard from members over the course of this national project. Make it concise and accessible, acknowledge tension around the term woman, address barriers to using additive language, modify wording around sex and gender, increase transsexual representation, revise definitions and usage of terms, highlight intersectionality and reflexivity as a continuous practice, add content on resiliency-informed practices, and add new examples for applying recommendations in relation to a rural setting, REB review, qualitative research, proposal writing, and knowledge translation. Next. Our Language Matters section discusses the limitations across all approaches to language. We must be intentional about our choices. The most important practice is to reflect on the language used throughout the research project to ensure that it does not unintentionally exclude those who should be represented within and benefit from the research. Gender additive centers specific identities, such as cisgender women, without excluding anyone else who can also be affected, for example, trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people. Gender neutral, there's a risk of erasure of issues that could disproportionately impact women. And anatomy-based risks of dehumanizing plain language considerations. Next. The new national guide has been led by these three messages from our members: acknowledge the tension around women, address barriers to using additive language approaches, and normalizing use of cisgender by the research community. Language is ever evolving. Within the course of my 2-year involvement in the project, language has changed. It is vital that this work be done in a continuous way that recognizes and addresses this. Next. Our example section combines community-informed scenarios using glossary terms nested in research processes, and the examples provided are not prescriptive guidance. Rather, they are illustrative of how our principles and practices, as well as glossary terms that can be used to enable gender-inclusive language. The glossary terms are something I want to highlight, as our beyond the binary is something unique to others. These terms were informed by community partners, and that the references in it link to community organizations at the forefront of the language discussion and gender equity advocacy. Next. Lori, is this yours?
It is. Thanks, Heather. These are some of the principles and practices that were very important to us as a research community. And as you can see on the slide, continuous refers to commitments to equity and justice that have to be continuous if we are to practice gender inclusivity in a good way. Agile, acknowledges that language and terminology are constantly evolving. We practice reflexivity to locate ourselves within research and the relevant social and cultural context of the research. And as members of the research community, we too have a responsibility that people who can benefit from research framed as women's health are not excluded. And engage. Connected to that, we meaningfully engage individuals and communities whose identities, experiences, and circumstances are diverse to help inform the use of inclusive language. Our colleagues, BC Pomeroy and Dana Ross, will dive deeper now into how engagement should be guided by trauma-informed practice and a real-world practice reflexivity in a research setting. And so with that, I'm very happy to first introduce BC Pomeroy, pronouns they, them, who is an expert in trauma and resiliency informed practice, or TRIP, and its application to research. BC trains researchers and facilitates safe spaces for the research and evaluation communities, patient partners, and community members to work collaboratively. And Dana Ross, pronouns she, her, serves as a psychiatrist and clinician educator within the trauma therapy program at Women's College Hospital, while holding the role of assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. In her clinical practice, she provides trauma-focused group psychotherapy to adult survivors of adverse childhood experiences. And as a First Nations physician, she finds fulfillment in her role as a mentor in the diversity mentorship program at the U of T, embracing the opportunity to contribute to the growth and development of aspiring healthcare professionals. Over to you both now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lori and Heather, for giving that background. So we can go to the next slide, please. So patient, family, and community-centered care really is a foundation for quality care across Canada. And when we consider engagement in this project, our team prioritized a patient-oriented research approach. This work had to be done in partnerships and co-produced with the individuals and communities impacted and the organizations who are providing services and programs. And through the process, we very quickly realized we needed to add justice-oriented to our approach as a way to name and account for systemic discrimination related to gender in the Beyond the Binary project. Our goal collectively was to mitigate to the best of our ability harm or even reharming of community when we partner on research teams, not as participants, but partners in research. Next slide, please. As we reflect on how to support the system to engage with diverse and hard-to-reach populations, we must acknowledge two current realities with respect to trauma. The impact trauma has on the populations that we want to engage with, who've experienced the most health inequities, and the impact trauma has had on the healthcare workforce. If we do not acknowledge and address this trauma, we risk creating relationships and environments where people may be re-traumatized and feel unsafe, thereby creating further barriers for working together to improve health outcomes. This led the Beyond the Binary team to incorporate the recognition of trauma into our engagement practices through a trauma and resiliency-informed approach. When a trauma and resiliency-informed approach is taken, the communities we engage with will be more likely to enter into relationships willingly and trust that their safety needs will be met. British Columbia's Fraser Health Authority developed an innovative program for direct service providers designed to address this important connection, a mental health and resiliency program based in the principles of trauma-informed practice and care. The program aims to reduce stigmatizing behaviors by enhancing knowledge and skills related to trauma awareness, self-compassion, and compassion satisfaction. It works on the premise that stigmatizing behaviors show up in conditions where health and other service providers don't have the knowledge and skills to identify and address trauma and trauma responses in themselves and in the people they serve. This program focuses inward as well as outward by giving service providers, and in this case for Beyond the Binary, researchers, members of the research team, the tools to appraise their own responses to distress and teaching them how to employ compassion-led strategies to support the activation of resiliency. Next slide. Given the nature of our Beyond the Binary project and the communities we were wanting to engage with, we adapted this TRIP approach specifically for research and evaluation. There are currently few considerations to mitigate or reduce reactivating trauma for either patient partners or researchers and other members of research teams. Often, the entry point of patient and community engagement or research and evaluation is for the patient partner to share their lived and living experiences with the intention to improve healthcare services or delivery. In this case, to inform and prioritize the Beyond the Binary project and guide. We know that as researchers, like myself, we also bring ourselves into this work. There often can be a duality as both researcher and a part of the community requiring gender inclusive and or gender affirming care. Initially, all we did was lean into TRIP's first principle, which was acknowledging the prevalence of trauma for both patient partners and researchers who have this duality. Focusing on that first principle helped create a safer space, opening receptivity, which led to rich conversations and contributions to the Beyond the Binary project. Next slide, please. So let's share a few of the practices and the ways these principles may have been applied and were applied throughout our project. So research in trauma and neurobiology shows us that the need to protect overwhelms our natural desire to connect. So intentionally forming relationships, providing opportunities for both informal and formal time together as a community steering committee is sort of the model we used. We prioritize this relational approach. We embedded principles of co-creation, like co-creating terms of reference that included a safety lens. The group initiated and co-produced a self-care guide for those feeling overwhelmed by the work, because that happened throughout the years, or where places of tension and unease exist, because they do. We prioritize well-being, sharing mindfulness practices as a group and individually. We also considered expanding consent. Think about that. What does consent look like beyond, yes, I understand, and yes, you can use my data? Consent was ever present and iterative throughout the project, right down to how members wanted to be recognized or identified in any publications. At one point, we were sharing published resources, and one of our members recognized that they are part of that research from 3 decades ago. Previous research didn't always indicate individuals from community who were involved. The other aspect of consent to consider is the removal or modification of one's consent. For those who may be in transition, or for some who were impacted by hate on social media or became uneasy, there needed to be a choice to remove consent or modify how they were named in the project. And continuity, continued opportunities to partner, opportunities for current members to mentor others who are interested in being involved. And we continue to ask and invite how members want to be seen and heard as we expand this project pan-national and into audiences like we have here today. Next slide. So taking an intersectional approach to research can really help inform our choices in language use by better considering intersecting identities of the communities we want to engage with. Gender is not experienced within a vacuum, and intersectionality acknowledges how multiple factors coexist and compound oppression. Women's health research in Canada has undoubtedly raised awareness of the implications of sex and gender on well-being and has informed health research policy and practice. Yet tendencies to lump all women's experiences together, disregarding intersecting social positions, undermines the integrity, rigor, and applicability of science. Next slide. Reflecting on our positionality builds accountability into our research processes, relationships, and outputs. It is through reflexivity that we can identify, acknowledge, and mitigate how our unconscious, and I challenge conscious biases and assumptions show up in our decision-making. One of the main points made in the guide is that this is an ongoing process that requires engaging with yourself, this idea of self-reflexivity, and being in relationship with others. And at the same time, there's a need to explain the relevance of gender equitable research and to communicate complex concepts to health researchers who may not have been exposed to social sciences or the humanities, ideas about social constructivism, or critical social studies of science and medicine. I would say that our work is still a work in progress in terms of making the ideas about identity construction, positionality, and reflexivity simple. Understanding and articulating our own identities can help eliminate biases we might bring into how we prioritize certain research topics. In its simplest form, it can show us our unseen areas and account for those in how we move forward. And now I'm going to hand it off to Dana.
Thank you so much, BC. I'm so happy to be here and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about, describe our research team's trauma-informed care study that we're doing at Women's College here in Toronto. I will then consider how to embed trauma-informed care, or TIC for short, into healthcare research, and we've heard a bit about that already. So on this slide, thank you. Our TIC study has progressed through several phases. So in phase 1, the goal was to identify gaps in trauma-informed care education and assess the need for an asynchronous or self-paced virtual course on trauma-informed care for healthcare providers. So what we did there is we conducted a needs assessment with 106 healthcare providers using a questionnaire and conducted 28 individual interviews. And we spoke with patients and providers and healthcare staff in leadership positions at 2 urban hospitals here in Toronto, Women's College Hospital and CAMH. One of the things that we really heard clearly through our needs assessment was that the course needs to be for all healthcare staff, for the entire healthcare organization, not only clinical providers. And we heard that loud and clear. And so we made that change to the study moving forward. The paper on this phase is being submitted this month, so hopefully will be published in not too long. Based on what we learned in the needs assessment, we moved into phase 2, where we've developed a trauma-informed care curriculum for all healthcare staff, and we're in production of the multimedia trauma-informed care course as we speak. We're going to evaluate that course first for feasibility, usability, and acceptability, hopefully in the winter. And in a future phase 3, we'll assess the course's impact on things like knowledge and confidence and other key outcomes, probably with around 70 healthcare staff at Women's College Hospital. And eventually, phase 4 will focus on implementation. Next slide, please. Let's look briefly at our trauma-informed care curriculum for the virtual course. It's structured into 8 key modules, including an introduction to trauma and its impacts, an introduction to trauma-informed care and why it's important, understanding the impact of trauma on healthcare relationships. We'll talk about the neurobiology of trauma, give some guidance on when and how to ask about trauma in clinical settings, talk about being sensitive around physical touch, managing emotions, and very importantly, applying and implementing trauma-informed care in the workplace and looking at these systems levels, issues and implementation as well. So another thing that we learned in the study so far is that healthcare staff have often actually had some exposure to the concepts of trauma-informed care in the past, but they were not sure how to implement those principles in their day-to-day work setting. And so each of the 8 modules includes a subsection, 4 subsections on psychoeducation, on equity, diversity, and inclusion, on skill building, and self-reflection, all of which is really aimed to help staff who are taking the course integrate these principles into practice. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some key principles to keep in mind when we are thinking about integrating trauma-informed care into our research practices. So of course, safety is paramount. So we need to make every effort to help participants feel as emotionally and physically safe throughout the process as possible. This involves not only the physical environment and how we arrange that, but also how we approach any sensitive topics. Informed consent is another critical aspect, and BCU spoke to this beautifully already. I'll just underscore, it's not enough to just have participants sign forms, as you were saying. We want to really clearly explain the research and then ensure participants really understand their choices, including the choice to not participate, so that they're really able to make those informed decisions. We've heard some about ethical reflexivity as well, but here it's thinking about it as an ongoing practice, where we as researchers really reflect on our own biases and privileges to try to understand how our perspectives might influence the research process. And so an example of this in action would be our research team met yesterday for our regular meeting. We went through these slides together and went through these principles together to talk about what we felt we were doing well and where there was areas for more growth or more exploration or curiosity. And as a team, we agreed to continue this conversation and put it as a standing meeting item. Another key areas of the use of language, we're going to hear about that today a lot. And by using, for example, inclusive gender sensitive terminology, we can avoid unintentionally excluding individuals who really should be represented in this research. Trust and transparency. So when possible, sharing results with participants and being open about the research process. So for example, letting participants know who to ask or where to find any published material. An actionable item that came out of our meeting yesterday was a decision that in all of our new studies, we'll provide participants with a REDCap link where we'll upload the paper once it's published, so they can really easily find the publication that they were such an important part of. We, of course, always want to be mindful to try to reduce the risk of re-traumatization. So designing our methods, our methodology in a way that reduces the chance of triggering past traumas for participants. We're often thinking on our team about what measures we're using, what questions we're asking, what demographics we need, and trying to think about all of these questions thoughtfully each time. Equitable representation is another cornerstone, by ensuring our research doesn't just focus on certain groups while marginalizing others. Really important, both the burdens and benefits of research are fairly distributed across diverse populations. And finally, empowerment plays a crucial role. Involving participants as partners in the research process allows for a more collaborative and respectful approach. We try as much as is possible to provide participants with control and as much choice as possible on how they want to engage. Next slide, please. And when we're doing trauma-informed research, it's of course important to think about that bigger picture, the cultural and contextual factors that shape how trauma is experienced, which really means things like recognizing historical and intergenerational trauma, especially in marginalized communities. We all know trauma doesn't affect everyone in the same way. And it's really crucial to remember that different aspects of identity can play a role in how trauma is experienced. And so for us to be aware of those social determinants of health, we can make our research as much as possible tailored to meet the specific needs of those people who are involved in a particular project. Another key aspect of trauma-informed care is providing support and resources, like offering debriefing sessions for research participants and maintaining sustained engagement with participants throughout the process, making sure there's lots of touch points, lots of clarity around who to contact. Making our research inclusive and accessible can mean building strong relationships and designing research that fits the needs of the community, as well as that constantly reflecting on our own biases and assumptions to make sure we're not unintentionally excluding or marginalizing anyone. Next slide, please. I'd like to close with a quote from one of our patient participants, which captures the essence of trauma-informed care to me. So just make it safe, knowing what kind of context your patients are coming from. To me, that seems like a moral imperative. And this quote reminds us that ensuring safety, inclusivity, and contextual understanding is not just an option, but a moral responsibility when it comes to providing care and conducting research in trauma-informed ways. I want to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dana and BC, for walking us through the process by which we engaged in Beyond the Binary. I'm now happy to introduce our facilitator in the next section, Jack Woodman, pronouns they, them. Jack is Vice President, Strategy, Quality, Risk, and Privacy at Women's College Hospital. Jack has a passion for improving health, equity, and the care experience at individual, population, and system levels. Over to you now.
Thanks so much, Lori. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the implementation strategy discussion portion of the agenda. And today I get to speak with our panelists about implementing gender inclusive and gender expansive research and research ethics. And I will admit that both personally and professionally, I have lots of thoughts and opinions and some knowledge as well. So I might pepper in a bit, but I'm really looking forward to giving these two the opportunity to offer their insights on the ways that a resource like Beyond the Binary Canada may enhance their own work towards more gender equitable health research and practices. So today we have Dr. Bethan Kingsley. Bethan is a research associate with the Women and Children's Health Research Institute and supports academics, clinicians, and community members to do qualitative research, engaged research, knowledge translation, and integrating equity, diversity, inclusion, and sex and gender-based analysis into their research. She completed her PhD and postdoc at the University of Alberta, and that was after moving to Canada from the UK in 2005. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Catherine Dwyer, who is a senior research manager, Women's Health Research Institute, and a member of the University of British Columbia Children and Women's Health Center of British Columbia Research Ethics Board. Welcome, panelists, to this session. So why are we here? I think you heard quite a lot about that, as historically health and healthcare research has disproportionately benefited the health of cisgender men. Research that evaluates women's experiences of health conditions and health and care services has been very limited. And that which is considered the health and gender beyond traditional binaries is often overlooked completely, even in what are considered the most progressive of research institutions. Add to that the critically important health outcomes and experiences of intersectional identities, and we see a gross misrepresentation across health and healthcare research today. We know that our most outstanding scientists and clinician scientists both want and need to create socially and scientifically just research that addresses gender bias and gaps in health and healthcare. So I feel lucky that I get to chat with a couple of those scientists today. So Catherine, I'm going to start with you. And I actually have a two-part question. Thinking about your experiences on research ethics boards, which I know you have a lot of experience, how do you think that this guide and our resourcing package can help reviewers promote accuracy and equity in the conceptualization of research and also in the implementation of research?
Thanks, Jack. So many of us are familiar with the TCPS2 or the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is the Canadian guideline for the ethical conduct of research involving human participants. And research ethics boards in Canada use the TCPS2 as the foundation for their operational and guidance documents, which include requirements for informed consent. And one of the core principles set out in the TCPS2 is that of justice, which holds that particular individuals, groups, or communities should not bear an unfair share of the burdens of participating in research and should not be unfairly excluded from the potential benefits of research participation. And this was beautifully articulated in the last presentation by Dana. And the justice principle maintains that researchers not exclude individuals from the opportunity to participate in research on the basis of attributes such as culture, language, religion, race, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, linguistic proficiency, gender, or age, unless there is a valid reason for the exclusion. And given this, inclusiveness in research and fair distribution of benefits and burdens are really important considerations for researchers and research ethics boards. So the Beyond the Binary Canada guidance document, I think, provides a really useful roadmap to enable researchers to conduct gender inclusive health research. And although it's a resource to support gender inclusive language in women's health specifically, the recommendations are relevant to many areas of research and healthcare. And it seems quite basic, but for this guide and resource package to help REBs and reviewers promote more accuracy and equity in research, research ethics boards must first be made aware of the existence of this guide. So the first step to move forward should be a communication awareness campaign focused on Canadian REBs so that the Beyond the Binary guide can possibly be incorporated into existing REB guidance. And I think once reviewers are made aware of this guide, then they can begin to incorporate the practical recommendations of this guide, specifically in relation to language, into their review process. So moving back to individual reviewers and the principle of justice, when reviewers are assessing a study, an important consideration to maintain the principle of justice would be an examination of not only the study's explicitly stated inclusion and exclusion criteria, but also the language used in participant-facing material, like recruitment advertisements and consent forms, which are really the vehicle to communicate who is welcome or not welcome to take part in the research study. And one of the key learnings from this guide is the emphasis on why language matters and its illustrations of different approaches to language use. So I think this guide offers important insight for reviewers in that it illustrates how language can be more effectively used to promote inclusivity in research procedures and critically in patient-facing materials. And REBs and REB reviewers can play a role in the promotion of education and guidance with respect to the use of gender equitable language in research, given that all studies involving humans require an individual REB review. And this really presents an opportunity for knowledge exchange between REBs, reviewers, and study teams. So when considering individual studies, reviewers can take note of the language used throughout the research presented, reflect on whether that language may unintentionally or intentionally exclude those who should be represented and could benefit from the research. And I think that this would prompt a dialogue with the research team about language use in their materials and potentially a request for them to consider whether the language used accurately reflects who they're actually aiming to recruit without unintentional exclusion. And when returning questions like these to the study team for consideration, REBs and reviewers can also offer this guide and resource package as an educational resource and a means of supporting the team in their considerations regarding language use. So I think in this way, RABs can be an effective conduit to increase awareness and uptake of the guide.
Wow, thanks, Catherine. I think you answered my part 2 of the question, which were what were some of the important questions for us to consider, and you absolutely covered that off. And I hope that folks take that in terms of the ability to put that into use with your REBs. It's so interesting. Even the term women's health research can be exclusionary, whereas we know a lot of gender diverse, trans, or non-binary people may not see themselves in that. So I think we'll see that language evolve over time, and we already are in the ways that people are using it. So I'm going to turn to Beth then. You have experience supporting researchers to implement the sex gender-based plus analysis and EDI into their research. What are some of the main stumbling blocks you've seen, and what has worked to overcome these challenges? And I'm also going to ask you, how does a resource guide like Beyond the Binary contribute to evolving and improving practice?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, we're seeing more and more researchers incorporating EDI and sex and gender-based analysis into their research. Obviously, funding agencies are requiring it. But I'm finding that it's still predominantly with projects within the gender binary. So there's still some way to go, I think, in thinking about gender more broadly. But saying that, we are seeing an increase in the number of WCRI members whose research focuses on trans and non-binary health. So I think over time, this is going to continue to grow. And then in terms of the Beyond the Binary resource, I think it's going to really help to shift the discourse further and highlight the need for a broader consideration of gender equity in women's health research. So yeah, I think this will be reflected in more and more research as being gender inclusive kind of as we go. And then in addition to shaping the general conversation, I find the example scenarios in the document to be really, really helpful. So I have created a tool to help researchers with sex and gender-based analysis, and actually used the document a lot to do this. So yeah, it's going to be, really practically useful for researchers who maybe haven't thought about gender diversity before, or who want to incorporate more diversity into their projects. And then finally, I think, Catherine, you kind of mentioned this. I think the principles throughout the document of, reflexivity, agility, that kind of thing, are principles that we should all be applying as good research practice. So I think, those kinds of things can be useful for all researchers, whoever it is that I'm engaging with and in whatever context. So yeah, the documents can be really, really helpful as I move forward in this work.
Thank you for that, Bethan. It's interesting. I think sometimes we're in this stage where we're talking a lot about the knowledge translation, because we really have to make sure our teams and our scientists have that base knowledge and understanding. And then there's that other level of implementation science where you're actually taking that research and, for us in healthcare institutions, applying that evidence and putting it into practice. And in some ways, we're further out from some of that, although you see examples of it in terms of like Dr. Ross's work, and the evidence is coming forward and it is being implemented into clinical practice. So it's that balance of both of those areas. For both of you, you're in leadership positions within your research institutes. What advice could you share about successfully implementing research study guidance related to sex and gender beyond the binary? And what are some lessons learned to ensure research that encompasses sex and gender beyond the binary? And I'll start with Catherine, please.
Yeah. So in my experience, researchers are really eager to conduct more inclusive and gender equitable research, but historically, they've said to us that they're not sure about the best way to go about it. And I think, as we've heard this morning, this was really the impetus for the WHRI to embark on the Beyond the Binary in BC project, and now this national project, with the goal to inform guidance for gender equitable practices within our provincial research community. So when the BC guidance was first released, we at the WHRI were actually really pleased with the positive response to the guide amongst our own research community, but we were also pleasantly surprised by the enthusiasm for the guide amongst critical research and health partners, like our local health authority, academic partners, other research institutes, our REB, etc. So from my perspective, a key learning from this process is really the importance of an effective communication and knowledge dissemination plan to accompany the launch of this type of resource. Building initial awareness that a resource is available to help guide the research community in this area, I think, is really essential for uptake and helps to begin a dialogue about these issues. So I think step one should be focused on getting the word out that this guidance is available, and it can really help support research to do this work. And from our institute, awareness building about this new resource took many forms, including dissemination via our communication channels, giving presentations on the guide at various forums that are aimed at not only our research community, but also our various partners. And as a research institute, we also provide support to our research community. So we've also had the opportunity to engage with our own researchers and study teams directly when they interact with our support resources. And so when a team reaches out for support or consultation, we have an opportunity to make them aware of this guidance in an organic way and help guide them through the process of planning and operationalizing more gender equitable research.
Did you want to weigh in, Bethan?
Yeah, I'm just coming from the perspective, obviously, of a research institute. And, I think first and foremost, we need to model support and advocacy for gender equity in research. And like you said, Jack, as women's institutes, we've historically focused on cis-normative research. So still likely to be seen as kind of narrow in our interpretation of women's health. So it's only recently that we've begun to try and change this. So I think we need to make quite deliberate efforts to broaden our understanding of gender equity by using more inclusive language and introducing kind of operational strategies to support the shift. At WICRI, we've recently expanded our definition of women's health to align with the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health to include people assigned female at birth or people who identify as women, cis and trans inclusive, as well as gender diverse individuals who do not identify as women, but who share health challenges in common with women. So we're hoping, this shift will have a subsequent impact on the kinds of projects that are funded. And then hopefully on the members who seek to be part of and feel included by WICRI. And then we've got a dedicated position, my position, to support researchers who are looking for guidance in this area, using resources like the Beyond the Binary resource. So we can provide one-on-one support in addition to developing new resources and tools for researchers and trainees. And then recently we've created a community of practice for trainees interested in expanding their knowledge in these areas. So again, just having the resource, the Beyond the Binary resource, really helps shape these kind of conversations that we're having, and open new avenues for thinking differently. And then I think in addition to these changes, there's a need for advocacy, such as, I see that Beyond the Binary efforts as exactly that, to create a broader cultural shift so that research, not only includes trans and non-binary people, but that it also kind of avoids harm by using, anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, justice-oriented approaches.
Thank you. As each of you were talking, I was thinking about how, when we interact with our research teams and scientists, and there can be an inclination to say that we don't even have enough numbers, or it's not statistically significant to include people who exist outside of the binary. We haven't attracted enough participants to speak about that research, and then have a fallback of, again, the cisgender male-female binary in the research. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to look more deeply there about how we frame that in the context of our studies, in the context of gaps in our studies. And also, what I will comment on is in the building of trust, because I know at my own organization, it has taken years of building trust with communities who have been historically medically and harmed through research, to build those inroads. And I'm so happy that the guide includes that patient participant inclusion and engagement, because I think that there won't be responses and there won't be participants unless we invest that time in building that trust with the community, for them to feel safe to participate. And so, of course, we're not going to see those numbers there. And when I think about Women's College, I think about too how we've focused on creating a pipeline of scientists for us, we have something called the Emily Stowe Scholar Foundation, and we try to attract more, a broader range of scientists and young scholars and researchers who reflect those communities that we want to work in. And that also, it's just one piece of it, but a big piece of it. So I'll pose this for each of you. What's one of the significant challenges in that work that you think still requires attention and focus? And this time I'm going to start with Beth.
Okay. So just a really kind of short answer here, but I'm seeing kind of in my work that there are people in leadership positions who don't necessarily want to see the shifts that we're talking about, and seem to kind of feel threatened by the expansion of women's health. And so, sometimes there's people who are acting as gatekeepers, whether that's in granting spaces, publishing, in ethics. So I think we need to be able to support researchers who are trying to kind of make changes and are receiving pushback. So yeah, I love, Catherine, that you're here and you're talking in this way, because it gives me a lot of hope and optimism for how it can be. So yeah, that's my one kind of challenge that's been coming up recently.
Thank you for sharing that so openly. And Catherine.
Yeah, I think, Jack, you highlighted some significant challenges already, but maybe what I'd add is something that was articulated this morning, and that's to make sure this guidance doesn't become fixed or stagnant. And I think best practice in this area is going to continue to evolve and shift over time, as it should. And I think a guidance document like this should be responsive to those changes. The hope is that this is a living document that's reviewed and revised regularly to be able to continue to offer support and guidance to the community that need to see a model of how this can be done well.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's so it's changing so quickly that we have to stay at the forefront. And I think we also have to keep asserting ourselves and asserting controversial opinions and pushing those envelopes, because in a way of staying modern with gender and in institutions who see ourselves as the leaders, national and globally in sex and gender, it's very important that we maintain and assert progressive views in keeping with the next generations that are coming and reflecting the breadth and fluidity of gender that they are showing us. Or else, we really are going to fall behind the line on this. So again, I'm so grateful for the work you do and for sharing your views and opinions today. And I think for all of us, we can look into our own organizations in all the corners and see this work starting to rise up and catch that momentum. And I hope for everybody who is just viewing, and I can't see all of the participants today, but I hope that this gives you some inspiration, whether it's in your own research or within your own research ethics board work, that you can really start to elevate this. And if you're already elevating it, you can share it more broadly to extend those practices. Any final remarks from our panelists? This is your forum.
I'd just like to thank everybody for joining and their interest in this topic. And I hope that you amplify this guidance document.
Great. Thank you so much.
I would reiterate.
And with that, I shall turn it over to Nicole. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jack, and thanks to everyone who's been on camera today. I'm the Manager of Research and Knowledge Translation at the Women's Health Research Institute. Pronouns are she, her, and I was lucky enough to be a part of the original provincial project that started over here on the West Coast. And I'm going to be your facilitator today for our Q&A. And Jack, I hope you'll feel comforted to know our Slido audience, one of the top voted questions was we had a complete Zoom miss and couldn't pin your screen. So there was a comment about how you were missing from the screen and everyone upvoted that question. They wanted to form connection with the facilitator.
Well, I'm happy to connect or reach out at any point. Most people know where to find me.
Thanks so much. Yeah, they needed the visual connection. So apologies, folks, for the technical glitch on our end. We have some great questions and I'm going to go through in ranking order. I'll try to first assign maybe point in the question in the direction of who might be most relevant, but I think we have enough time and space that all of our speakers are welcome to jump in. And I think most of you folks can use the raise hand function if you want to go next, just since there's a few of us. And I think we can probably exit the screen share for this, but it's just a reminder, these are the folks these are the folks that you should be able to see pinned on your screen right now. So the first question is PHSA specific, but I suspect this question might be relevant outside of just a PHSA environment. And for those not within the province of BC, that stands for the Provincial Health Services Authority, where our research institute is situated. So what recommendations do you have for navigating the plethora of language guides available within our health authority? But I'm guessing that amongst this group, you will likely be aware of more than the ones just located in BC. So I wonder if one of my WHRI colleagues wants to take this on first.
I guess that would be
Lori.
me, Nicole. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, first of all, when I see the question, I think it's wonderful news to see so many different organizations and groups. And as you mentioned, this is a small sliver of just some of the BC-based organizations who are saying, we need to do better in this space of gender inclusivity in our work. Of course, here we're focused on research and research practices, but we're having the same conversations in other sectors as well, healthcare policy, et cetera. So I don't think there's a perfect answer because I think the different groups have adopted different approaches. One of the things that I feel really proud of in the work with Beyond the Binary is the commitment to the engagement with the community task force with the research task force. And that was, a commitment we made from the beginning. We were also committed to many of the principles that we shared on the slide earlier and reflexivity. And as Catherine mentioned during her remarks, that we acknowledge that this is a living document, that some of the recommendations, the case examples, et cetera, that we make in the current version of Beyond the Binary need to and should be updated as we continue to learn and unlearn in this space. So now to directly answer the question, what recommendations do you have for navigating the plethora? I mean, our hope really is that Beyond the Binary Canada can be a guide, that it can be adopted by different organizations and perhaps, adapted to the particulars of the organization. And again, I'm recognizing that it is going to evolve over time. So I'd welcome others on the group to share their perspective, but we very much want this to be accessible and available. You'll see when you look through the guide itself that we have a number of examples, so 9 examples that might show up very often in research of how does one navigate gender inclusivity on a consent form or on an REB application. So we've got some really nice, crisp case examples within that. And we recognize that the number of examples will likely grow and evolve over time. So I'll take a pause and invite anyone else to add in their perspective too.
Yeah, I can go if that's okay, Nicole.
Yeah,
Yeah, because I mean, that's such a great question, and that it's like at the top of that list. When we started this project, I would never have thought that a plethora of language guides would have actually existed in health research. So I think it's amazing. But what I think I see in the guide and sort of in our experience of doing this project and in other projects, when we think of theories of change and how to navigate all these language guides, really kind of start at that sort of place of being aware, which is why people are here today. They're being aware of Beyond the Binary. They know that it exists now. They know it's across Canada. We're here. The organizations that are sponsoring this are here, being aware of that. And then really it sort of goes deeper. And I think we did that naturally within our working groups for Beyond the Binary, but also within the guide, where then you become more informed. Then you start responding to things within your workplace. I mean, I'm with PHSA, so I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing that. And then ultimately you want to see things integrated or innovative utilizing those guides. But I don't think it's here, you do this, you do this, you do this. I think there are those guides, and as you start to become aware of them, you become more informed, and then hopefully you start to see yourself and your work and how to utilize pieces of those guides and thread them through the work that you're doing, whether it's in research or at point of care, is my hope for that. But I think it's pretty amazing that we have such a volume of guides now available, where a few years ago that just didn't exist.
Thanks, BC. Go ahead, Jack.
I'd love to challenge us to have a Beyond the Binary in medical and clinical language as well, because I think students get indoctrinated in a very particular medical model that does not necessarily look beyond that, and it would be amazing to get folks in the medical and clinical communities to be using that, because those are the folks who are going on to become the scientists and to be doing the research. And the earlier we can reach them, the better that will be.
there is immense support for that. And I know that's something that BC has brought up as well. I think to the point that this is a research, this was created primarily for a research setting, but that its application in the spirit of thinking outside of a research silo has broader application. Thanks so much. We have many questions, so I'm going to move us to the next one. I was wondering, for researchers practicing in a more conservative political space, have you had any political pushback to beyond the binary? And perhaps we can throw in, and if so, how have you navigated that? And I know, you know, Catherine and Beth Ann, you both talked about some of the challenges. So feel free to kick us off if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I haven't had pushback necessarily to kind of gender equity specific questions, but I have experienced pushback just in an EDI sense in general, of needing to do it. And actually, you know, provided some feedback to somebody in their grant application, and he got quite angry at me for it. And so, yeah, we ended up having a conversation about it, and I think came to a place of, you know, this is good for your research. This is going to make it more rigorous, and, you know, develop some understanding there. So I think, you know, meeting researchers where they're at in their journey on all of this, and trying to have, you know, very human conversations about it. So yeah, that's kind of how I've navigated it recently.
Yeah, I would echo that. I haven't received specific pushback per se, but you know, as a reviewer, you're looking at all kinds of different types of research studies from all types of researchers, and providing feedback, or have you considered this, or refer to this guide, you know, may or may not be well received by some. But I think the point is to start from a position of awareness building and normalization of asking these questions, just as, you know, a reflex of, you know, have you considered, is there an exclusion here by using certain language or certain terms, and refer to this guide. So I think anytime you're changing norms or asking people to do something different, you're probably going to get a bit of pushback, or people not being as receptive. But that doesn't mean we stop what we're doing. So I think that a certain amount of that is just to be expected.
Thanks, Catherine. Did anyone else want to weigh in before we move to the next?
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead, Lori, please go.
Just a very brief comment, and it was, you know, we started our discussion today with acknowledging that change is challenging, but that difficulty should not prohibit change. And I think this is where reflexivity, the opportunity to pause and reflect and be with and sit with difficult emotions, conflicting thoughts, and coming back to, you know, really what many of the principles that were introduced to us with justice oriented and trauma informed, et cetera. And, you know, let's lean into the discomfort a little bit, and not use that as a reason to not change and stay stagnant, because the rest of the world is moving ahead without us.
I don't even want to make a comment now, Lori. That was so well said at the end. So you know, very quickly, I will say what I think is important is to acknowledge, and somebody, I can't remember who spoke about the tension. I think it was you. Or
Lori.
it's not, yeah, Lori, about that tension. And there's that fear of erasure of women, and that, you know, historically have been so marginalized in health and healthcare research. And so really acknowledging that tension and not getting stuck in it, you know, and so making sure that we are on the right side of research equity in this discussion, and that we are moving the needle there. Because politically there is, coming at us potentially a lot of resistance that we have to acknowledge in the roles that we play. And so, yeah, my thought here is really to try to be a little more concise, is just that we must keep leaning in even when it is uncomfortable. And much like, 150 years ago, people wanted to erase women in medicine and health and healthcare research and science. There are people who want to erase the array of genders that exist in the world now, and it's part of our role to continue to build awareness and educate how important that is to reflect that.
Can I add one
Thanks.
more piece,
Yeah.
Nicole? And
Yeah.
I think that is that a lot of change, be it in healthcare or other areas, a lot of change comes from community. I think of HIV/AIDS in the 80s, these are community-led. You look at some of the largest foundations in this country, and they're Rick Hansen, they're Terry Fox. Like, these are people who have experienced their own healthcare crisis and decided to lean into that and create something to make change. And I think it's the same with Beyond the Binary. And I think for our community is we can't forget to keep engaging with community-led initiatives, people who are living and breathing this work. And again, speaking to that duality and ensure that those invitations and that participation and that sort of patient community initiated work is ongoing in collaboration so that we can move this farther in ways that are really helpful for everybody.
Thanks, BC. Yeah, I'm very grateful for our community partners who are here today. And grateful too. I mean, I think it's also worth noting, there's almost 200 folks in this virtual room today that do form a kind of community. So yeah, we can move forward together, as Jack was saying, and be on that right side of things. Speaking of community, this next question is more around kind of implementation, but it does reference how we collaborate with policymakers and community members to make recommendations based on research findings. The question doesn't specifically talk about a focus on gender equity, but I think that's probably where it's nested. So Heather, I'll let this marinate with you for a minute and see if you want to talk about how, as a partner, you would want to be engaged in terms of uptake of research findings, which segues great into what BC was just saying. Also curious if anyone on the panel wants to speak to the policymaker engagement aspect and connection to Beyond the Binary.
I can jump in a little bit on this one. I've recently applied for a grant. I don't know if I'll get it, but looking at neurobiology of trauma, and there's been a lot of really lovely reviews that came out lately, but they're very dense, like papers. And so the grant is about knowledge translation and how can we take that those findings and papers and turn them into patient-facing, community-facing, collaborative research where we can actually put that into action and use that clinically and in a research vein. But one of the big things about that sort of translation to practice and to research into practice is that funding piece. And so one of the things I talk about a lot at different meetings that I said that is that importance of funding these initiatives, and not just funding the researchers, but having enough money in that for the community partners, and to be really funding community partners as equals and as equal partners in that as well. So I just think that's a really important piece.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that I've learned about kind of the uptake of research is also that duplication is really important. And so that's kind of speaking to the fact that when we consider research uptake, It's often about policymakers, but it can really be used to train new generations of researchers who are able to then reach out and have that impact on politics and policy, kind of far beyond just that one research project. And I think that's really important, of kind of transferring the skills of being able to use this language is really important. And the more replication that we have, the more these identities are represented, and the more that, you know, policymakers have a hard time not addressing the issues because it's addressed in so many of the research projects.
That's such a great point, Heather. The next generation of trainees and political figures, and we are very grateful to the trainees who have been a part of these projects. The next question is, congratulations to everyone, great progress addressing the gender binary, but I wonder if we're still stuck in a sex binary. Thoughts on more inclusion of people with intersex traits?
It's definitely a demographic that doesn't have as much representation as others. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So thank you for that question. I think we're still, you know, from someone who runs a nonprofit and works with a lot of members who are under the rainbow alphabet, you know, there's the I is included in the initials, but it isn't often represented. And I think that's something that needs to be better kind of recognized, and beyond recognized, work towards trying to find that representation. There is a lot of shame that is still on intersex people. So we have members who have, you know, privately told us that they are intersex, but don't feel as comfortable talking in groups about it because there's still stigma and shame. And so I think one of the things we need to do, as those who aren't intersex, is to help create environments where they feel they are comfortable in being able to talk about their experiences, and also recognizing that sometimes participation isn't just in group settings, that we can have conversations and be open to one-on-one conversations so that people have that comfort. And, you know, they may or may not eventually feel comfortable in the group, but we are still able to get their experience and learn from them.
Thanks, Heather. And I'll just add in quickly that in our language section and glossary, as we absolutely acknowledge and state that, you know, neither sex nor gender are binary, and we include intersex under the definition of sex, remembering that sex is based on the assignment, typically by a physician or clinician at birth, based on what one individual sees. So it's a medical and a legal assignment. So very, very important that we include intersex for all of the reasons that Heather just mentioned. We also have one of our examples. As I mentioned earlier, we have some great examples that our community of researchers have put forward to help us, you know, how do we put Beyond the Binary guide to work specifically in these examples? And there's an example particular to the intersex population and how to be inclusive for intersex persons in recruitment. And so some examples in there. Obviously more work for all of us to do, just even being mindful of our kind of vocabulary day to day when we catch ourselves referring to sex as being male or female. And this is part of the learning and unlearning that that we all commit to, and that we hope Beyond the Binary plays some role in moving forward.
Thanks, Lori. The next question, many researchers do sex and gender focused health research. They can learn more, but have a good basis. How can they be leveraged as champions for implementation? I love this question. Not leveraged maybe, but how can we partner and yeah, activate them in our implementation goal?
think part of it is having them understand the lived experience of people who are gender diverse, to understand what it is like to go through our medical system. I run a group called Chronically Queer, which is for 2S LGBTQIA+ people with chronic health conditions. And everybody there considers themselves to have medical PTSD, which is that the system that we have to interact with is actively harming us. And so I think, you know, really hearing those lived experience stories helps to make the researchers understand why this is important and how this impacts people, and how we can make progressive change, and how that will better represent people. And the thing too is often people are thinking about patients, but we talk a lot about 360-degree accessibility. And the thing is that there are a lot of healthcare workers who are gender diverse as well, who don't see themselves represented. And I think it's important that researchers acknowledge that, and researchers understand that to create better relationships with healthcare workers and do the research and studies, it helps for them to feel represented and seen.
Thanks, Heather. Good reminder, our identities. Did anyone else want to contribute to that before we wrap up our question and answer session?
I think just one thing, Nicole. I love, Heather, how you've explained that too. And you know, this isn't a one and done. This is, you know, this is iterative. The guide is always improving. So how can we leverage them, you know, as champions? Is if you see examples out in your spaces that you're working in now, let us know. We can add them to the guide, and that'll help leverage, you know, some of the work that they're doing. But I kind of like using the term. I know a lot of people use capacity development, and it kind of comes from a place, you know, of learning. But I kind of think capacity bridging, like we're all doing this work together. And so coming together, events like this, again, beyond the binary, working together as a group, having communities of practice, you know, bringing people in collaboration and partnership to have these conversations. Again, it's a good way to leverage those champions for implementation as well. I think it's just creating those spaces that are safer, that we can have these conversations and navigate that unease in well ways, to continue learning and growing. This is just, again, this is just, it isn't a one and done. I've learned so much in the 3 years being part of this project, that I just think we're just going to keep continuing to learn and providing opportunities for that.
Thanks, BC. And I think you've addressed a few of the other questions that we had in the queue just with your answer. So just a note to folks who have put in their Slido questions, we will keep these and we're going to do our best. There's some ones just requesting links and resources, and we'll make sure that we'll add those to our follow-up email to everyone who registered for the event. And at this point, what we're going to do before we switch to the next session is, if you're in Slido right now, this segues from the last question. We're opening up a poll, and what we really want to get a sense of is that what might you do differently at this point after having experienced this? I don't think we need the screen up just yet, as long as folks are in Slido. So just take a moment and type your reflections, and we'll give you a moment to do this as we shift our screens and move into the next session. Thank you to all of the speakers who contributed to this Q&A, and I'll pass it over to, I believe, Tamil.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole, and all the speakers in the last panel. I felt both moved as I listened to you respond to those questions and inspired. And some of the things that I'm taking away is the piece around dissemination, which we are asking for the audience to provide feedback on now. How can we move forward with dissemination and knowledge translation? What tools would be most useful to you? really the importance of the next generation and replication. And I would say that's both with our healthcare providers and with researchers, and how we are supporting and making that generational change, and how we want to shift the paradigm and continue to do this, and to lean in. And finally, again, the encouragement to reach out to us with ideas, with examples, and the recognition of the evolution over time that's reflected in this national guide, and that we will continue to evolve. So now we're moving into our last panel, where we have the privilege of hearing from the research and community task force members who about what the Beyond the Binary process meant for them, challenges that they experienced, what they're taking away with them, as well as a key takeaway that they would like to share with this audience. So I will introduce them in order that they will speak, and then each of them will share their reflections. So first, we will hear from Dr. Fritz Pino, pronoun she, her. Fritz is an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Regina, and her research is really informed by critical intersectionality approaches, and she engages in decolonial qualitative research approaches that take a queer and trans diasporic lens. Her work aims to create culturally grounded interventions and approaches by centering the cultural knowledge and practices of marginalized groups and communities. Then we will hear from Tefer Adjemian, pronouns they, them. Tefer is the communications officer at BioCanrex, Canada's immunotherapy network, and an accomplished communicator who has advised McGill's Wellness Hub on creating digital safe spaces at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and has collaborated with several institutions, educational institutes, on developing inclusive communication. Tefer believes that accessible communication is the foundation for equitable work, and that commitment to inclusive communication leads to the development of inclusive policies. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Natalie Rosen, pronoun she, her. Natalie is a full professor at Dalhousie University in the departments of psychology and neuroscience, as well as in obstetrics and gynecology. She's the sex and gender science lead for the Maritime Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, also known as SPORE, and has extensive experience in sexual health research and knowledge mobilization in collaboration with non-binary and gender diverse people. And I am just adding a spotlight for Tefer. Thanks to all of you, and I'll turn it over to you, Fritz, for your remarks.
So I think, can you hear me well? Okay. I think the first point here is the challenges, during the research or during this process. And to be something that was a challenge for me involved in this process was whether or not my theoretical and epistemological stance of critical queer and trans perspective can be applicable to this context of health research, which has been dominated by positivist epistemologies. And I was really grappling in the beginning how to make such critical perspective matter to different audiences, including how these would land or translate to the community, both academic and non-academic audience or community. However, I appreciate along the way that this group is actually making room for such critical perspectives within health research that looks at women's health or even centering such critical thought within this project.
Thank you very much for that, Fred. Tefra, we'd love to hear from you.
So it was both a challenge and a highlight to dive into the language around reproductive care. As you said before, I am a communications professional. Language is my jam. And I am also a non-binary person and a non-binary birthing parent, so I have experience within the medical system personally. I have both professional and personal insight into the importance of the language we use. There is so much terminology, as we've covered quite a lot today, that is tightly binary and gendered in medicine generally, but particularly in what we usually term obstetrics and gynecology. And the sheer volume of it can be overwhelming. Sometimes this project felt a little bit like terminology whack-a-mole. You come up with a different option and then realize that one also has binary elements. Even the term women's health, as we talked about before, can be a barrier to care, as there are so many people who are not women who still require the same form of reproductive health care, which really highlights the importance of this project. This is a very necessary project, and I'm so happy to see it implemented. It was such a pleasure to speak with so many people from so many experiences and backgrounds, and to get a full scope view of the diversity of experiences attached to and impacted by this project. Each of us has a different story. We've experienced the medical system differently as patients or as researchers, and all these stories add nuance to the project. I'm really delighted to see the initial diversity, and I look forward to seeing it expand even further as this living document continues to grow. I'm really going to take away from this. We talk about gender equity often in broad terms, but for every broad term we use, there are hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, with their individual stories. Sometimes it may feel for patients, for members of the public, that regulations around research are too high level to have a day-to-day impact. But the more accessible our research is, the more accessible and applicable our healthcare becomes. And that is just, it's so significant. So finally, just language matters so much. The terms that we use to discuss care can be a barrier or an invitation. Building habits requires basic, easy to implement changes. We all know this. If you try to start a new habit all at once, you're going to burn out within a week. But if you start with one little change, it's much easier to build. So the terms that we use here, using inclusive language is that first easy to implement change that leads to considering inclusivity in all elements. I often say that EDIA begins with the words we choose. It's an easy change to effect, and it makes a world of difference. So it's been a pleasure to be on this project.
Thank you so much, Tefra. And Natalie, I'll give you the last word before I close for a reflection.
Thank you. Thanks. I wanted to spend my few minutes talking about one of the challenges mentioned earlier in the session and which really resonated with me, and that is about navigating the emotional response since I began doing this work. As I learned more, there was a lot of embarrassment, regret, and even shame looking back at the mistakes I felt I made earlier in my research career, with conflating sex and gender, conveying heterosexist expectations, poor language around inclusivity. It was all there. And I still tend to feel nervous, even in situations like today when I'm sharing about my experiences as a researcher, because I worry I will say something wrong, I'll miss something important, and I wonder if I'm the best person to be here on this platform, considering my own identity and social position. I understand now that becoming aware of this emotional reaction is an important part of practicing reflexivity, but it's still kind of stressful and it's certainly challenging. And one of the things that I've learned is that I'm not alone in feeling that way. I will continue to feel this sense of discomfort because I will make mistakes again. And this is a concern that students and healthcare providers have shared with me, and that the emotional responses can be a barrier to making changes in your research and advocating for change in the work being done around you. The danger is that discomfort can lead to disengagement, and this is what we have to guard against. As Lori said earlier, we need to sit in the discomfort, recognize that discomfort is not a bad thing, that discomfort leads to self-reflection, growth, and change. And beyond that recognition, many of us here today are well suited to help others manage their own feelings of discomfort. And we need to be patient and understanding and generous when other people make mistakes, and remember that this is part of their process of learning and making changes. And it can also help to remember that some people might be tired of being patient, and that's okay too. What I've also come to learn is that there's a community of people, including beyond the binary group that's here today, as well as resources like the one introduced today to help us face the challenge of conducting gender equitable and inclusive research. And for me, it has really helped to connect with others about questions and concerns I have or the approach I'm planning to take. So that message of talking to others, connecting with resources and community is the final key takeaway that I would like to leave you with today. And I thank you very much for involving me in the process and for inviting me to share some of these reflections with all of you.
Thank you so much, Fritz, Teffer, and Natalie, for those insights and reflections, and for the time and expertise that the three of you, but indeed all of the research task force and community task force members have dedicated to the development of this Beyond the Binary National Resource Guide. If you'd like to turn off your cameras, you can do that now, because it just falls to me to thank everyone for attending today, and to encourage you again to read the guide. We have the QR codes that you can scan for both the French and the English version. If you find it valuable, please share it. That will be an important part of the dissemination by the almost 200 folks who were here today. Through your networks, we consider you champions for this work, and want to support you in that role. So please, as has been said by my other colleagues, if you have comments or questions, recommendations for examples to be added, ideas about next steps in dissemination and knowledge mobilization, please reach out to me at Power and to Nicole at the WHRI. Also, next slide, please. Please subscribe to Power's newsletter and follow us on social for updates about this work, but also about other work going on. We're having our next virtual seminar on November 14th, which will discuss menopause, both from clinical and community and social science perspectives. It is in the same time at the same place, and you can register using the QR code on the screen or from Power's website. Next slide, please. And I want to close with these wise words from Elder Sandy Leo Laframboise, who did us the honor of opening this event. You have to go slow to go far. And this really brings our attention back to the importance of being vulnerable, including by practicing self-reflexivity and investing the time in building genuine relationships and understanding. So on behalf of the WHRI and of Power, I sincerely thank all of those who have been on the journey with us thus far and all who joined us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to being in touch with you as this important work continues to evolve and move forward. Thank you again.